The latest. Thank you for your love and support. I appreciate you all. France is in a state of total panic, and the evidence is right in front of us. I've been following the breakdown of this so-called African Forward Summit held in Nairobi, Kenya, and let's be honest about what we just witnessed. This was not a meeting of partners. It was the desperate final funeral of Francafrique. Emmanuel Macron is trying to rebrand a sinking ship. He abandoned the traditional Francophone capitals and fled to Kenya, hoping the world will ignore the fact that he was just shown the door by the Alliance of Sahel States, AES. But the analysis from those who actually understand these dynamics is devastating, and it proves that the game is finally over. Please, if you haven't subscribed, subscribe, hit the notification and select all. Let's talk about the strategic move to Nairobi. Why there? The experts were clear. This is a classic case of a thief caught red-handed who changes his clothes hoping no one will recognize him. They are running from the Francophone zone to the anglophone sphere because they know their influence in our backyard has collapsed. They are betting on the idea that the English-speaking world hasn't noticed the pattern of domination and extraction we have been fighting for 53 years. But here is the reality. The Anglophone world has its own foundation, its own strength, and its own interests. They are not looking for a new colonial administrator, and they are already watching what happened to us in the AES. They see right through the mask.
There is also a clear double standard at play, because France and President Macron did not acknowledge the terrorism affecting these states as a major problem that needed to be addressed. That is to say, he accuses the states hit by terrorism of being themselves guilty simply because they are victims. He seems pleased, as if saying it's because France was driven out that terrorism continues. They forget that they were there for 10 years before being expelled.
Does not accept the way it was because our countries are facing insecurity due to the fact that France does not accept the way it was thanked that France is pre-positioning troops. In the north of Côte d'Ivoire, Benin, all around the AES countries, and then goes to Kenya to give speeches about equality. For what reason would these countries attend such a meeting if it's just to be told to accept the return of French troops since the agreement? The colonial agreements have been denounced. On what new basis can France now return to these countries, and how, especially when calling them names like Putis, calling them all sorts of names, using negative labels, how can they meet to talk as equals if in the very discourse there are already remarks that do not foster this partnership of equals? In my opinion, when looking at, there is frustration, there is anger, there is the feeling of humiliation from having been expelled from the three countries that have so much expressed so loudly by the French president. I think that even if they weren't there, they were heard. And Africa heard them even more clearly thanks to their absence than if they had been present. Because by being absent, Anglophone analysts have now made the effort to refer to the AES countries and to everything that those countries criticize France for, to say to Kenya, you had no right to roll out the red carpet for France because you know what they have done and that they have been expelled elsewhere. The Nigerians feel the same way. The Anglophones, you have to go read the Anglophone sites, are already prepared to block France's path. It's not the only country, a colonizing country. Why isn't it England playing that game? Why is it France, and France alone, that wants Africa, that clings to Africa, that holds on to Africa and plays this game? England was also a colonizing country. And England granted independence to its former colonies, just like France did. But it's France alone that has maintained colonial agreements, continuing to play the very role of administrator with these countries. So for me, I think it was better that they weren't there so that France could fully reveal its games. Because what they would have done is they would have taken up even more of the news than what France itself said. On every show where the French president was invited, listen to what he said. It's always about blaming the AES countries that weren't there. So I want to point out that we are at the end of our allotted time, but we will address one last point before saying goodbye, specifically about the attitude of the French president, who is widely criticized for being condescending and making paternalistic remarks. So, do you see that Emmanuel Macron truly considers Africans as his partners? Because we always get the impression that he is always trying to guide us and reframe us. Mr. Diallo.
No, Emmanuel Macron never even considered Africa as having intelligence. Remember, in his speech, he even said that he considers Africa to be a continent. What was it before? It was a chicken farm. Well, I don't know. We can't just now start considering Africa as a continent. Well, Macron's paternalistic attitude, I think I would have been surprised if it were the opposite. Honestly, it's the opposite that would have surprised me. Someone who knows Macron very well, he
claims to be a true Pan-Africanist.
Yes, when he said that, for those who were at the memorial, Thomas Sanger, they certainly heard the rest of the captain breaking down at the memorial, over there. It's outrageous to say that he is a Pan-Africanist. I don't know, he was dubbed a Pan-Africanist in Kenya, while we weren't there. As for me, I want to go back to Macron's paternalistic behavior. You know, as I said, and I insist again, Emmanuel Macron is the typical example of what Thomas Sankara says. The imperialist is a bad student because he never learns the lesson. From the experiences of his predecessors, from experiences from writers, from experiences from TV talk shows. Someone like Antoine Glazer writes, arrogant as a Frenchman in Africa. Later on, he also wrote Macron's worst African. All of this was to draw Macron's attention to his paternalistic behavior. But what does that matter to us? These are genes, actually. These are reflexes, instincts that are there, ingrained in him, which he can't get rid of like a train station. That's it. The same France for the countries that welcome that France. Cameroon did indeed come back to the fact that it couldn't, when it was understood, it couldn't refuse. But if you carry out a coup d'etat, you come and try to whitewash it with rigged elections. You don't want France to speak out? If France summons you, you will go. If you make a constitutional amendment, you disguise it as a constitutional coup d'etat. If France summons you, even if you are sick, you will have yourself represented. If you have a bank account in Paris or in Montreal or in Montpellier, if France summons you, you will go. All those who went must remember that the same France that says it will support those countries is the same France that supports the terrorists in the Sahel. And to remind myself of our tough times, we used to say that it's hot water that makes spaghetti soft. It's the same Oshul that shapes the future. So Emmanuel Macron can't change overnight just to please his... He doesn't have African origins. Why would he love you? Are you part of his family? No, he's just there. For French interest. And people should take inspiration from that and kick him out of their land. That's my take on Macron.
Thank you. I'll start with Dr. Nebier. Should we see this as a summit of renewal? Or on the contrary, is it an attempt by France to preserve what remains of its influence in Africa?
Thank you very much, Ms. Munira. Africa Forward, or in other words, first the France-Africa Summit, which I believe became, starting in 2010, the Africa-France Summit, and for the first time in 2026, Africa Forward. So these significant shifts in nomenclature also show that France is actively searching for a more suitable and appropriate title that might perhaps help the general public to eventually forget the deep-seated harm and historical damage that France-Africa has caused in Africa, as well as the lasting harm that the Africa-France summits have caused across the continent of Africa, or have not been able to repair in terms of harm caused by the France-Africa summits. And it's not obvious that changing the names, moving from the Francophone lexicon to the Anglophone one, and also joining forces with Kenya, because Kenya hosted the summit this year. I see all of this as an attempt, as I was saying, by the French authorities to show that they want to move forward. But are they really moving forward? The France-Africa Summit has been around since 1973. It's now 2025. It's true, there have been times when the summit skipped a year or two, but overall there have been more than 30 such summits. And at every summit, commitments are made, resolutions are adopted, and denunciations are voiced. France itself monitors its behavior in Africa. But has that really allowed us to make progress? In terms of the sovereignty of African countries, in terms of holding France accountable for what it has done in Africa, I don't think so. Let me remind you that President Emmanuel Macron, when he was a candidate in 2017, specifically in February 2017, during a visit to Algeria, he himself said, or rather denounced, colonization as being war crimes, crimes against humanity, my apologies, committed by France, and that France needed to issue an apology. That was in Algeria in February 2017 when he was a candidate. He was elected in November 2017 and he was in Ouagadougou. He repeated it again, but this time he didn't talk about the crime against humanity committed by France. Because when he said that in Algeria and then returned to France, the politicians gave him a bit of a hard time about it. But in Ouagadougou, he spoke about crimes as well, about genocides, and said that apologies needed to be made once again. And the third act is that he commissioned, or rather ordered, a report where instead of offering apologies, they think we should just move on from everything that happened, let it go, and look to the future. So when you look at it, they themselves are aware of the wrongs they committed in Africa, of the responsibilities that need to be acknowledged. Today, to conclude on this issue, whether we change the name or move from one Francophone country to another Francophone country, Anglophone countries, I don't believe that this is the way we will succeed in restoring trust between France and Africa, whether it's Francophone Africa or Anglophone Africa.
France is trying by all means to present this summit as an economic and political framework that is more balanced, based on mutual respect and trust. Is this a way to rebalance relations between the African continent and France? Do you believe in it, or do you think France is simply forced to adapt and attempt to conform to current geopolitical realities?
As a matter of fact, we have to acknowledge that France is currently actively seeking to revitalize and relaunch both its diplomatic relations as well as its economic influence across the African continent. It's as if she has been caught like a thief who has been discovered. It's as if they've been caught red-handed in a way. So they say to themselves, here, I can't go on with the same outfit, the same masks, the same fragrances. I have to change. And you will have noticed that this happened just after they were driven out. Manu, a military man from the Sahel region, therefore in more than 40% of what was called. His precarious French situation, the precarious French situation, that he has indeed gone far away, over there on the English-speaking side, and not just any English-speaking country. He went to Nairobi in Kenya, and Kenya is a rising power economically and indeed diplomatically. And I would call that a political and diplomatic fraud. A political and diplomatic fraud. Because he arrives, and if you observe his language is ambiguous, it is not genuine, and his promises are false. So it's off to a bad start again. I'll explain why I say that. He comes with promises. Let's start with the promises. You know, he said that he is indeed coming.
Ready to give $23 billion to Africa. But what means does France have today to give $23 billion to Africa? And you know, this kind of announcement, as they say, is just for show. It's like in Burkina with Paul Kabateba, who was supposed to raise 18,000 billion. We never actually saw even 100 billion arrive in Burkina Faso because it's not fresh money. It's where Well, they just assign value to a certain number of economic programs that we launched together, and the rest is just promises. And worse, it's not France today, where all the shops are closing down, that will actually be able to provide 23 billion. And Africa, according to estimates, needs 375 billion today. So it's not really 23 billion that will do the trick. Then when I say that the nation of France appears to be entering this situation in the position of a loser, or is quite clearly arriving at the table with a long list of formal complaints and is effectively engaging in a form of deception, at least when we are speaking in strictly diplomatic terms, it is important to note that the city of Nairobi in Kenya is demonstrating those very same qualities in a much more pronounced and significant manner. A country that is part of the entire English-speaking Commonwealth. They have an entire strategy oriented toward Great Britain. And everything is already set. It's not there that they will really be able to change much. Not much at all. And that's what actually creates the ambiguity. In the message, he acknowledges that they had a poor approach in the Sahel, since he says, we are ready to come back. And by coming back, we are indeed committing not to do as we did before.
Like before?
But before, what did you do? Clear language requires that we start by saying, here is exactly what happened. It's like apologizing for a wound. Yes, we say we're not going to forgive, but we don't know why we're forgiving. We say we're not going to come back, but we'll do the same thing. But what is it that you did wrong and won't do again? In any case, they have indeed chosen. They have chosen the English-speaking world, but they haven't changed their approach at all. Why hasn't he changed his approach? Because he comes in, look at his attitude, and that says it all. That means he comes in actually insulting African populations. When people started to actually present something that could affect France, and when people started to act, he tried everything. Basically just to block. Then it's simply an attempt to block and not actually let this go through, to the point where he was even willing to make a fool of himself. Secondly, Macron, by going into the English-speaking world, actually wants to bring together and manage to gather 30 heads of state, including heads of state from ECOWAS. But he always proclaims the slogan, Africa Forward, while the reality is that he is actively protecting and prioritizing France's own interests, which is a lie. When you look today at the relationships we are criticized for with our new partners such as Russia, China, and India, but it's clear we're not talking about aid. We're actually talking about relationships. Open, expressed, and balanced interests. A win-win relationship. That's what a relationship of honesty is. If he had maintained such a relationship, spoken in such a way over there, I would have thought he was starting to change. But he always went with false language, false promises, and insults. So for me, this statement is just political deception. But what we should regret is not what France does.
Well, it is.
It's what the African states themselves accept. Imagine 30 prominent African heads of state sitting down together with a French partner who originally comes from that very region, having gained extensive experience within the Francophone zone. Yet, he effectively and deliberately excludes the Sahel, specifically 3 key Sahelian countries. And remarkably, in that room, absolutely no one is able to stand up and say, we simply don't understand why these 3 important Sahelian countries aren't here with us today. So that means they are effectively becoming accomplices of France in its strategy. But they will end up paying the price, because it will be the same thing.
We will come back to this point later to discuss it in more depth. So, Dr. Sangare, do you really think that this Nairobi summit could mark a break for France with the legacy of the France-Africa summits, given that these summits have long been criticized to serve as instruments of power and influence for France over African countries?
Honestly, for me, this summit, I followed it closely, and I truly believe it was the absolute worst summit that France has ever had in its history.
The worst?
The worst compared to everything that has happened so far? Because in Montpellier, he had exclusively held meetings with civil society and positioned himself strategically as a viable alternative to meetings with various national heads of state.
So I must say that I am quite surprised that the current French president is inviting various heads of state and government leaders again to this summit. But it's an incredibly emotional and significant summit. It's an emotional summit where he made a point of invoking the old cliches of partnership, of friendship between peoples, of everything that connects us in history without actually going back into history to say what went wrong in the past. And it's also an emotional summit because he has suffered too much all year. Look at everything he has endured. You're talking France's leader. President Macron has suffered all year long. Everywhere he went, he was humiliated. With President Trump, Emmanuel Macron endured every possible humiliation on the international stage, not to mention what was happening in his private life, where truly all year long he has done nothing but take blows due to his own missteps. Even at the European level, everything he tried to do to establish himself as the leader in European political dialogue on Ukraine. Once again, he was rebuffed by his European peers. So, when all is said and done, all that remains for Emmanuel Macron is Africa, his traditional African sphere of influence, where he can still venture alone. He can personally convene the various heads of state and be able to do what he truly does best, orchestrate a grand political spectacle. But I think it is truly a shame for the French taxpayer, because even though he arrived accompanied by business leaders, it is ultimately just a waste of money. Every single penny that was spent on this entire tour was purely for his own personal public image and reputation. It was far more for himself than it ever was for the benefit of France, since I truly don't see how you can justify going all the way to Nairobi, just to spend your limited time simply talking and engaging in empty conversation about the Sahel and the AES, about everything that happened in the AES. He should have come to the AES, but if he had come to the AES, I don't know in which AES country, even if he had come to a neighboring country, to Côte d'Ivoire, to Benin nearby, I'm not sure it would have gone the same way as it did in Kenya. And for me, I really think that, and even in Kenya, there were protests. There were protests. He came to defend French interests. And as for which French interests today, I think he himself understands very well. Everyone has understood France's game. France's interests are not Africa's interests. And when he organizes a summit to talk about France's interests, to identify possible avenues, action in technology, in any sector he truly believes to be promising for the future, it's not going to work because there are better offers. No one is going to ignore China or other emerging countries that have better technological offers. To go work with France, which itself is trying to reposition, there is also a clear double standard at play, because France and President Macron did not acknowledge the terrorism affecting these states as a major problem that needed to be addressed. That is to say, he accuses the states hit by terrorism of being themselves guilty simply because they are victims. He seems pleased, as if saying it's because France was driven out that terrorism continues. They forget that they were there for 10 years before being expelled, and that it's not because they were expelled that terrorism continues in these states. They were there, not just France, but all the European countries, even NATO. They were there with Takuba and even everything they tried to do in Mali. It didn't work, and he doesn't go back over this point. It's as if he easily excuses himself for having been expelled. He blames the states for not being smart enough to expel France, but he doesn't take responsibility for France's failure. During all the years when terrorism took hold, when terrorism spread, he was more interested in drawing maps to show how terrorism was gaining ground, but not in admitting that they were there with surveillance resources, with intelligence, They had all the necessary tools to nip this phenomenon in the bud. So it's an emotional summit, but it's crocodile tears, because everything he tried to show as good faith is, to me, just theater.
Then there is the $23 billion figure they keep parading around. Let's look at the numbers. It is an insult. The panel hit the nail on the head. If African states simply committed 1% of their own GDP, they will dwarf the aid package in less than 2 years. This isn't development. It is the same old extra activity model. They come here, they strip our resources, they send the profits to Paris, and then they offer us back a fraction of what they stole under the label of investment. They don't even have the capital to back these promises. As it was said on the panel, it is theater. It is a show for the cameras, while their own economy is drawing in debt. We are at the end of a system, and the AES has accelerated that collapse. Macron didn't dare hold the summit in the Francophone capital because he knows those leaders are terrified of their own people. The youth of this continent are no longer waiting for permission from Paris. We see through the paternalism, the same arrogance where Macron acts like a principal scolding his students. He talks about equality while funding the very insecurity that destroys our progress. We are choosing a different path. We are building partnership with Russia, with China, with India, North Korea, nations that bring real technology, real infrastructure, and real trade, not just condescending lectures on how we should govern our own land, be patriotic and culture. Macron has become the external student who refused to learn the hard way, because now Africa is saying enough is enough. We are no longer waiting for people to come here and scold us, people to teach us what to do. We are no longer ready to be dependent on any other person. We just want to be dependent on our own self, build our own self, take control over the resources that are on our soil. We just want to start managing our own affairs, because for over years, decades, the African affairs, our everything has been managed by other people outside of us. So now the African has seen that there is a problem somewhere. We can't talk about solving the problems of Africa when we are still looking out for solutions, because the world do not understand the tradition, the culture, the norms of Africa. So importing foreign norms and solutions to the African problem doesn't help. So we have leaders who have risen to change that narrative by finding solutions within the African context to solve the African problem. And this is what our leaders always sit in African Union, ECOWAS, ANC, SADC to be preaching. And we have also seen that the same Emmanuel Macron is preaching for Europe to be self-dependent, not depending on the United States of America. And this is exactly what the leaders in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso are doing. But like the panel said, they thought we can forget. Moving away from Francophone to Anglophone is going to change anything. But we have seen the trend, we have seen the pattern, and there is nothing again they can do to convince the African that they are here to protect us. We are now fighting for our total dependency because we believe that we can do it, and we can be leaving everything on people to come into the continent to do anything for us anymore. The time for the African has come to do something for ourselves. And like the Finland president said, we have to be players in this new world. The old world where Africa used to depend on people is over. And then Europe is also advocating for that self-dependency. And they see that this new world, you need yourself not to be depending on other people. So why do the same people have problem when Africans are rising to make sure we also fit well in this new world? In this new world. This is amazing. We are the only ones that can set ourselves reunited. We stand, divided we fall, and united we keep standing forever and ever. The greatest enemy of the African is mental slavery. So let's decolonize ourselves from mental slavery. Let's keep sharing to educate our brothers and sisters. Together we'll make Africa great for ourselves and the next generations that are going to come. So that's the latest around the world. In Africa, West Africa, in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso.